Ladies and gentlemen, it is Sunday, March 7th, 2021. I'm working on the weekend, and so is Ian Bliss, CEO of Northern Shield. No days off for guys in the mining business. Ian's here to just give us a bit of an update. It's not so much a specific thing. I know a lot of people want to hear about the drill program that just started at Shot Rock, but I also want Ian to walk through some of these new zones at Root and Cellar, because I'm not sure people appreciate the scale. I mean, granted, they're still targets as opposed to zones, but even so, I was impressed when Ian started bringing out some of this stuff on Conquest Zone. I mean, these are big targets. They definitely have scale, which is the first hurdle in exploration. Is essentially, is it big enough to bother in terms of spending exploration dollars? But before we talk about that, thanks for coming on, Ian. And can you just give us a quick run through on what you're going to be testing with your phase 3 program at Shot Rock?
Yes, absolutely. And thanks again for having me, Eric, to update our shareholders and your followers. So we've just started drilling at Shot Rock. Again, the focus is in the highway zone. It's part of this sort of 6-kilometer trend of epithermal systems that we discovered back in 2018. There's multiple fluid cells or epithermal cells here, but I said the real focus is the highway zone. We started drilling the highway zone, the maiden drill program at Shot Rock in 2020, sort of a 16 drill hole program over 2 phases. And that included one hole, drill hole number 4, which intersected, this is a fairly high grade gold, 4.2 grams per ton over 3.15 meters and 12 grams over 2.45 meters. And that was fairly high up. It was only about 100 meters down from surface. Of course, we follow up with some further drilling in the phase 2 drill program. We hit a lot of large veins, but not very high grade, typically in the 0.1 gram per ton range. And we kind of now know why we see that. I mean, here's a sort of schematic section of the classic epithermal system with hole number 4 represented here. And so here's the typical sort of tree-shaped epithermal system. And we were hitting the gold up in here in hole number 4 on either side of these very late gabbro dikes that intrude through the system. And of course, we have a lot of gold on surface. The subsequent drilling with these very large quartz veins was below the level of hole number 4 in the high-grade gold. And so that's why we're expecting higher levels. And of course, we're a little bit disappointed that we didn't get those high grades, but these are very significant widths of quartz vein. And we now sort of know that the gold that we saw in hole number 4 on the surface is sort of escaping up from lower down in the system by exploiting weaknesses along this dike contact. And so fluids were allowed to sort of migrate to surface a lot higher than they normally be expected. And so the big quartz veins we hit in hole number 11, 12, and 16 in the second phase of drilling are actually what we think are the top of the true epithermal system. And the other gold we saw is escape to surface. So subsequent to that drilling, we of course ran a CSAMT geophysical survey, which is very good at picking up resistive rocks, so very quartz-rich or silicious rocks. And that's really helping us target the current phase of drilling at Shot Rock. And so this is just a plan view of a lot of the red squares are current surface samples. You can see there's a lot of gold on surface. The yellow squares are gold bearing samples from the first 2 phases of drilling. And the blue polygons are the outlines where we have these very strong resistive features identified on the CSAMT survey. And I'll just show you an example of that. This is line 4, so this is sort of in the heart of the highway zone. These yellow stars represent the gold we see on surface. And of course, here's the high-grade gold we intersected in hole number 4. But what we're seeing at depth are these very resistive features. Let's say resistive, basically the cold colors, the whites and the blues are your resistive features on the CSAMT survey. And so we like some of these features down here, R1, R1A, and R2. And you can see that sort of below this blanket, a very resistive material. And this is partly just very silicious siltstones, but it's also sort of a silica cap. And that's what you expect to find on top of these epithermal systems. And all the drilling to date has really been intersecting rocks up here, which is really above where you want to be. We believe this is the boiling zone down in here. And I say the gold that we see is basically escape to surface by exploiting weaknesses along some of the dike contacts. And you can see here, this white dot represents one of the very large quartz veins. We hit it in hole number 11. You can see it's just sort of above of one of these siliceous zones. And again, that deeper down that hole, these red stars are pathfinder elements that we often associate with the epithermal system. So we're picking them up in the right area. Again, over here in one of the drill holes, we see gold and pathfinders at the very end of the hole. Had we continued that, we may have intersected this resistive features. And so we get these really strong resistive anomalies on the CSAMT survey, and that's what we'll be testing in this current phase of drilling. And this one is quite nice too, because it's flanked by the, go ahead.
Just a big advantage here to the CSAMT, I guess, that helps people appreciate how you have these targets now. It's got a lot more depth penetration potential with, you know, with readings you can trust. I mean, you can go fairly deep with CSAMT and still be relatively confident in your readings, like something like IP, which I think you did some of that before. It just doesn't read deep enough to pick this stuff up.
Exactly. We're seeing this section is 400 to 500 meter depth. The survey actually goes deeper with a little less reliability, but still you see the features continuing to depth. But certainly reliable in the first 400 or 500 meters, especially when you get coupling like this, where you get the very resistive feature flanked by more conductive material, which we think is the clay alteration, which you expect to see on the fringes of an epithermal system. And we think that's what this is here. And so one of the very first drill holes that we've just started will be coming down and testing this feature and actually hitting it at depth down in here. And we hope to get both these features within that drill hole, as well as just clip this blanket, which we think may be a clay blanket on top of a system that hasn't quite reached to surface. And so this first drill hole sort of give us a lot of answers.
That's a pretty deep hole by the look of it.
Yeah, that's going to be about a 500 meter hole.
Okay.
And so just so you can see it again, here's another section. Again, the top portion here is the more detailed first 400 to 500 meter depth section and more detailed contouring. But you can see it continuing at depth. This now goes down to about 1,000 meters. And you can see there's this unit in here, and there's a breach, a very clear breach where there's more resistive material breaking that layer. And you can see down here, very, very strongly resistive material. So I say it, the geophysical survey shows that these things do continue to depth and very good dimensions as well.
Okay. No, they look like great targets. I mean, we've all had our fingers crossed on Shot Rock for a while now. So hopefully, as this old saying goes, third time's a charm. You want to walk us through a little bit on Root and Cellar too, because I know that's been your second marquee project for a while now. I mean, a lot of people are just following this for Shot Rock, but I think it's important to understand Root and Cellar too.
Yeah, absolutely. I say Root Cellar is located in the Burn Peninsula of Newfoundland. And again, it's really being explored for epithermal systems. You have several discoveries both to the south of us along the peninsula and to the north of both high and low sulfidation epithermal systems. We think we actually have a combination here, or sort of a transitional phase from a copper porphyry, which are related to epithermals, through the low sulfidation, or even mesothermal, into the low and high sulfidation epithermal systems. But we have, there's a lot of gold being discovered at Root and Cellar right now. We have originally 4 gold showings along a 5-kilometer strength, and we just discovered the Windfall Zone with up to 17 gram per ton gold and 56 gram per ton silver. I'll show a little bit more detail on that later. But obviously, a lot of gold. The red squares are the rock samples from surface. The yellow are the soil samples. And we've been following up on the soil samples, and that's how we discovered Windfall, was simply by following up on gold anomalous soil samples. And we did the same thing in Conquest. And so the soil samples seem to be representing gold in bedrock at Root and Cellar very, very well, whether that's high grade or low grade, but it is representative of gold in bedcrop or subcrop. But as you can see, some very high grades on the western end here, drop zone, 45 gram per ton gold, nearly 1,400 gram per ton silver. As I say, there's also copper that we think is related to copper porphyries in the southern portion of the property. And we'll just have a little closer look at the Conquest Zone, because again, as you said, I don't think people really appreciate the scale. And again, the red squares are surface samples, the yellow are soils, and we have a sort of a 700 meter strike length where we're getting pretty continuous bedrock mineralization in gold, whether that's 100 ppb or up to 45 gram per ton gold. So there's a box here about 700 meters by 500 meters where there's gold being found on surface, a lot of stockwork style, so we're probably very high in the system. And then sporadic high grade, which are probably again, the gold mineralization exploiting fractures and dilating zones in the bedrock. But already, 500 by 700 meter box, and the soil sample suggests that continues on perhaps for about 1.4 kilometers in strike length. So considerable bedrock mineralization in gold. And the prospector did find visible gold in the conquest showing, the original conquest showing this is a channel sample with some VG from the past years. I say this is a classic example of the mineralization we see at the conquest zone. A lot of stock work, so this tells us we're fairly high in the system, but these are highly altered rocks. So again, this is a very long-lived active system. A lot of this is sort of in the 100 to 200 ppb range, but then you'll suddenly come across a fracture zone where you're getting 26 or 47 grams per ton gold quite regularly. So a very extensive area and very well prepared by these fluids.
Okay.
And this is a sort of a magnetic inversion section through the conquest zone. And again, we're going to be doing some more ground geophysics, but here are some of these very high grade samples we find on surface indicated by these red arrows. And below that, we see a fairly deep penetrating magnetic low, quite distinct. And we think that's the main zone. And we're just getting a little bit of leakage of this material coming up the surface along these fault zones. So we'll back this up by some ground IP and resistivity, but certainly based on magnetics, we very much like the look of this target here. And you can follow these sections are over about 500 meter strike length, and it's open at either ends. And of course, just to the north, to the left of these images, we'll see shortly, we have the windfall zone as well. So we see a lot of gold on surface, and that's sort of mimicked by this very interesting magnetic low continuing to depth.
Right, and like shot rock, you're probably looking at something highly silicious.
Exactly.
A lot of silica giving you a maglo. Okay.
Yeah, and a lot of magnetic destruction, whether that's the clay alteration or the silicification. Right. So one of the discoveries we came up recently, again, based on following up on this very high soil sample indicated by this yellow circle in here, is what we call the windfall zone. And that was a traverse down this stream in here. And there's not a lot of bedrock. Most of these samples, let's say there's now 29 samples that are gold anomalous, anywhere from 0.1 gram per ton up to 17 gram per ton. But what we have is a shear zone here where we see the shearing, the fault in bedrock, and then sporadically every few meters we find quartz boulders or quartz and outcrop over that 200 meter width. So we believe these boulders are in situ because they actually follow a geochemical pattern quite clearly. So we don't think they've been moved at all. And so what we have here is what appears to be a 200 meter wide fault zone with numerous quartz veins running along those shear planes. And so we really only see it here because this is where the bedrock is exposed. And interesting too, the volcanics here are eroded. Probably this fault zone, cross-cutting fault zone, created a weakness. And the volcanics that overlie this unit here, which are really phyllites or a sediment, they cap this system. It's been eroded, exposed in the underlying unit, which appears to be where most of the gold is hosted in the fault zone. We see some of that faulting coming through the volcanics, but not very much. So the underlying rocks, the sediments, it seems to be where most of the gold is being hosted, and only where some of those structures are strong enough to penetrate through the volcanic sequence, which sort of covers it, do we start seeing gold on surface in this area. And that the same may hold true to the conquest zone. And maybe that the gold we're seeing is just those amount of fluids that are exploding up through the volcanics. But if the same hold true in the conquest zone, then would very much like to drill through the volcanics and see what's underlying the volcanics in the conquest zone as well as windfall. But let's say this appears to be a 200 meter wide fault zone with numerous quartz veins running along that. And so we'd like to do geophysics on that. We're just getting ready to cut some grids and do some ground resistivity and IP surveys, both at windfall and in the conquest zone.
Well, like I said, the first hurdle to jump a lot of the time when you're doing early stage exploration is scale potential. Is it big enough to bother putting the investment into? And this thing definitely seems to have scale potential. And I take it from your comments that it's pretty flat here, and you don't really have a lot of hope of finding significant outcrop unless you're actually standing in a stream bed. There's just not much around. So
yeah, especially on this northern boundary, you know, the red is sort of highlands, but as soon as you get off the volcanic sequence, it's very flat lying and not a lot of outcrop. But we do have soil samples to follow up on that.
And what geophysics do you think would be useful here? Is that your next step?
Yes, we're looking at, I mean, ground, first of all, IP, simply because the amount of sulfides we have is a lot of disseminated sulfides, particularly in, we see sort of two phases to all the mineralization, quartz, sericite, and pyrite alteration, which carries low-grade gold, and then the quartz veinlets, the stockwork with the larger veins here, which really bring in the higher-grade gold and silver. And so something like IP will pick that up very well, and of course, any resistivity survey will pick up the siliceous nature of this. So we'll run a combined IP and resistivity survey. And then later on, we'll run an airborne MT or ZTEM survey to really find out some of these other targets. It's a very large property right now. We're expanding it as we speak. And we'll fly a larger survey to see what else is out there.
Okay, I mean, and you're clearly, I mean, from conversation with you, I know you're getting pretty, you guys are all getting pretty pumped with this project. What's you know, in a sort of a vague sense, what's the timeline going forward to try to move this into drilling? You've obviously got more targeting you've got to do with the geophysics, but I mean, what are you thinking in terms of a timetable here?
Yeah, I would like to get on the ground geophysics by May, perhaps late April, May. When, you know, let the snowpack go down a little bit, but then do that survey with the aim of trying to drill by end of June, or more likely July, the time we get those geophysical results back. And same with the airborne MT surveys. The atmosphere right now is not really conducive to that. You really have to wait for some of the lightning storms in the area to pick up. And so that's going to be more in the spring, perhaps April, May as well. And so, you know, we're very keen to get drilling, but we need to get the geophysics done first. So I'd aim for end of June or July to get a drill program running at Root and Cellar. Initially focus obviously on the Windfall zone as well as Conquest.
I mean, they're nice looking large targets. I like this project from the day you picked it up. It just seems there's so much going on here. I know people are interested in the porphyry, but it's probably worth mentioning that if Ian is seeing at surface what looks like the very top of an epithermal zone, unless there was some post-mineral faulting or the thing's really telescoped for the time being, you probably got to assume the porphyry is pretty deep. But I guess you're hoping maybe the airborne is going to help you out when it comes to
the airborne survey.
Yeah, the airborne will help you trying to figure that out, maybe. In terms of
exactly. I mean, as I say, it's a large property, so the airborne will hopefully figure that out, show more of these gold zones. But the airborne survey should pick that out. But certainly in the copper, where we are high in the system, these things can, you know, telescope and fluctuate. So we may not be too far away, but there's no, you know, we're getting copper mineralization on surface, but it's not the heart of a porphyry system. So that's probably at depth, and one of these airborne surveys should help in picking that out.
Okay, and a property that a lot of subscribers and I know a lot of shareholders ask you about. It's been there for a long time, and maybe there's a bit more interest now. Do you want to go through the Windfall stuff a bit? I mean, I don't know if there was anything else in Windfall that you wanted to cover.
Well, the only interesting thing about Windfall is here, say on the northern contact of the sort of volcanic center, and we have drop zone, which generally has a similar signature, very high in silver, like Windfall. There's tellurium, tellurites in both prospects. And again, up here, Braxton Bradley, again, there's high gold, high silver to gold ratios, and a little bit of zinc and copper. So these things all seem to have the same signature. I say that fault zone trends basically along this white line. So could be a substantial strike length, not only a wide zone, but a fairly substantial strike length of potential mineralization on that northern contact, of which Windfall seems to be the thicker portion at the moment.
Okay. Yeah, no, so that dotted line is a fault.
That's really the sort of contact of the volcanic sequence and the underlying sediments.
Okay, gotcha.
And then I said the copper porphyry potential, I'll say the focus is the gold, but there's certainly some very spectacular copper mineralization lying around the southwestern portion of the property. You can see very distinct zonation. The green are all the copper samples, whether in soils or in rock. The yellow the gold in the soil. So they're very distinct zonation, and that's sort of what leads us to believe there may be a telescoping of a porphyry system onto the epithermal gold.
Okay.
But as you mentioned, there's some general interest in EDFIX as well, the nickel PG project that we've had on the back burner for some time. For those of you that are not familiar with EDFIX, it's in the northern end of the Labrador Trop up by Coujouac in northern Quebec. And we have a 3 to 4 kilometer strike length of significant PG mineralization on surface, up to 16 gram per ton channel samples. And then we drilled this thing as well with a joint venture with Impala back in 2013. And we did hit, a true PGE reef. It was relatively low grade, so 0.2 to 0.4 gram per ton, but over significant widths, 30 to 40 meters in some cases. But we did run a VTEM survey after the fact. There is an indication that there at least was massive nickel magmatic sulfides around with nickel copper PGEs, and particularly the area where we get a lot of our concentrations of nickel and copper samples on surface. And we have this very strong conductor in between these two showings. And down in here, there's no exposure whatsoever. It's down in this lowland area in here. And so there's two concepts to EDFIX. First of all, chasing out the massive sulfide potential. I said we do see these globules of sulfide around. These globules are transported away from a pool of massive sulfide the time this sill was intruded. But there's also the PGE potential as well. And just to get an idea of that, we've only done 13 or 14 drill holes at EDFIX over a 7 kilometer strike length, so very short holes. And what we see is here's a sort of true reef, relatively low grade, 0.2 to 0.4 gram. But we actually see all down through in here, we see about a 0.1 gram per ton platinum palladium, over 50 meters, some of these holes over about 100 meters. And the average sulfide content in these drill holes is only about 0.3% sulfide. And yet we're getting sort of 100 to 400 ppb PGE. So if we can see places where that sulfide content has increased, let's say 10 times to only 3% sulfide, you could be getting some significant grades, perhaps 1 gram over 100 meter thickness in this thing. So, there's two sort of a two-pronged approach to this. It's the massive sulfide, as well as seeing if that sulfide content just ticks up a little bit to 3%. To 3% sulfide, you can barely see in the rock sometime. But there is significant amount of PGEs flying around in this sill over a strike length of about 7 kilometers. So, that's one of the reasons we don't want to walk away from it right now. I mean, it's not too many places where you see that amount of PGE mineralization over a fairly continuous strike length.
Yeah, well, as subscribers will know, when I introduced and started talking about Bitterroot about a month ago, a big part of the reason I was buying the stock late last year was tenor. And that's essentially what Ian's talking about here. I mean, this is, 0.2 to 0.4 at basically a 0.2 to 0.5 sulfides that's very high tenor stuff. I can see why. I mean, obviously you still got to find the accumulations of the higher sulfides to find the better grades, but you can certainly see why a lot of your shareholders keep asking about it, because the tenor numbers are great.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of science behind this that supports the theory of, we kind of know what's happened geologically as to how this formed. And so there's still plenty of room to chase this up, both the magmatic sulfides and particularly the disseminated nature of this PGE mineralization.
What do you think the next step is here, Ian?
It's a ground geophysics. I say we've only done the airborne EM. So what we'd look to do is a ground EM survey, perhaps UTEM, which will look deeper for those massive sulfide conductors and a little bit more refined. And of course, if we're following up on the PGE reef potential, we'll do an IP survey, because there won't be enough sulfide to be picked up on the EM. But an IP survey will pick up that disseminated sulfide. So we'll look to do a few traverses across this, perhaps very late spring when there's still a little bit of snow on the ground, and both an IP and perhaps a ground EM survey.
Okay. So yet another project for people to focus on. And now with battery metals being so hot right now, I wouldn't be shocked to find out you're starting to get phone calls on this, because I know there's a lot of guys looking for nickel copper projects right now. It's a thing. So I think that's a good update, Ian. I mean, you're starting a drill program with some pretty exciting targets, potential boiling zone, high grade stuff at Shot Rock. Root and Cellar is really coming along well. I really like the scale potential there. I mean, you gotta get some holes through it at some point to get a feel for what your vein density is and what your grades are and stuff. But it's definitely got you've got several zones there that individually have enough scale potential with grade on surface to definitely be worth chasing. And Nativix has always been an interesting project, still is. I think you were right to keep it on the back burner for a while. Nobody really cared for several years, but I think you might get some more interest for that now too. So it's nice to see you got a bunch of things going on, and you guys are good for cash for a few months. You don't have a necessity to go running back to the market right away or anything.
No, we're good for these drill programs and the planned geophysics at Root and Cellar.
Okay, that's great news. Well, hopefully the drill gods smile on us this time, and the third time is a charm. Northern Shield, NRN on the venture, NHF RF, I think, in the US. People are subscribers know I followed the company for years because I'm a big believer in supporting groups that actually go out and look for new stuff. Hardly anybody does that. Everybody pays lip service to it, but the truth of the matter is almost nobody goes out and looks for literally new things. And this is something that Ian Bliss and Christine Viancourt have done for years now, and they got a bunch of great projects, and they're all new stuff that's never been drilled. That's what makes it exciting. Thanks for coming by, Ian. I will probably start pestering you in 3 or 4 weeks about the drill program. I'll give you guys a chance to get going on it first, but you can be sure I'll bug you in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks for having me, and I look forward to updating everyone in the coming weeks.
Talk to you later, people.
Yep.